How would you like to write with a dynamic, powerful, energetic style? Well, in this lecture, we're going to be looking at writing with power using action verbs, expletives, nominals, passive versus active voice, and the key principle, save the verbs. In this lecture, we're going to explore one of the really powerful tricks to developing a better writing style. Fagley in chapter 27 says, write with power, make your writing active. And a key to that is to pay attention always to verbs. Fagley says, express the action of your sentence as a verb. Wait, what? Put the action in the verb? But I thought the action always is in the verb. The verb is the action part of the sentence, right? Well, consider this sentence. Disputation of the government's claims has been widespread and consistent. Where's the verb? Well, the verb is has been. Where's the action? The action is disputation. A common bad habit is to shift the action from the verb to other parts of the sentence, and Fagley gives examples in paragraphs on page 352. Now, sometimes people are confused. Where is the verb in a sentence? Well, if you want to be sure, mentally change the tense of the sentence. Disputation of the government's claims is or has been widespread and consistent. There we see that has been is the verb. The word that changes is the verb. The action, well, it's become a noun. It's important to understand that in writing, the action verb carries energy. They keep things lively, and they also reduce the word count. Action verbs are tight, and shifting the action adds words. Here's that sentence we had a moment ago, disputation. Well, look at this revision. People consistently dispute the government's claims. Fewer words and an action verb. Now, what would you say is the most common verb in the English language? Well, it's the verb is, or to be, are, were, was. What's the least active dynamic verb in the language? Same thing. The word is a verb, but it has no action. In your writing, how often do your sentences center on a weak inactive verb like to be? Inactive verbs are perfectly correct and useful, but if your writing has a steady style of using them, you have a dead, lifeless prose, and you're going to strongly trend toward wordiness. Let's briefly look at three very common stylistic features that kill the action and the dynamism of style. First, there is structures. Fagley calls them expletives in 28C. Now, this is a perfectly sound stylistic option, but it's weak and low energy, and it tends to add words. Where's the verb and where's the action? There is a trend toward private ownership and operation of prisons, which is a factor in producing political pressure for increasing the prison population through harsh criminal laws and sentencing guidelines. Look at all those green words that contain action, but the verbs are both is. Once you eliminate the there is structure, you can often write with power and conciseness. So, for example, that last sentence, let's revise it. Private companies that operate prisons raise demand for services by pressuring legislatures to enact harsh criminal laws and sentencing guidelines. Fewer words, more action. Our second stylistic feature is called nominals. That is, verbs transformed into nouns. The action is frozen and it usually requires extra words. So, disputation is often a worker response to management assessments of worker efficiency. Versus, workers often dispute management assessments of their efficiency. Now, nominals are very common, and believe it or not, you know how to create them. For example, if you have the word dispute, what's the noun form of that? Well, yeah, disputation. Observe becomes observation. Calibrate becomes calibration. Assimilate becomes assimilation. How often are you transforming verbs into nominals? Now you'll find in scholarly writing a lot of dull style which is heavily nominal. Assimilation of immigrants is generally achieved by the second generation, versus immigrants generally assimilate by the second generation. There's no reason why that sentence can't be written the second way. Or observation of subjects was performed weekly versus we observed the subjects weekly. Note that there is a current trend in scholarly writing to accept the first person in describing methodology. This is a good reason to avoid nominals and use active verbs. Our third weak stylistic device is called passive voice. Here's an example of an active voice sentence. Isaac Newton constructed the first mathematical model of gravity in 1697. Here's the passive voice version. The first mathematical model of gravity was constructed in 1697 by Isaac Newton. Or there's a tendency to lop off that last bit. In those examples, we see the result. In the active voice, there's a stress on the agent of the action, the person who's doing the thing, and it packs the punch of an action verb. In the passive voice, there's an objective description of the action, but it de-emphasizes the agent of the action and has a weak impact with smothered verbs. Now, like all of the stylistic devices that we're looking at, the passive voice does have strategic uses. Suppose you want to write about a mistake someone made, but you don't want to emphasize the person who made the mistake. You could say in the active voice, "You submitted a report which omitted key statistics." Or you can use passive voice. "The report that was submitted omitted key statistics." Or even better, "The submitted report omitted key statistics." There you have an action verb. The other strategic use is to present empirical methodology without stressing the researchers. Instead of "we observed the subjects," you can say "subjects were observed at 1 week intervals." Nevertheless, the passive voice can be misused. Since the agent of the action is de-emphasized, sometimes this can dishonestly conceal responsibility. Mistakes were made in the oil spill causing pollution. Yeah, well, who made the mistakes versus Exxon made mistakes? You see how the first one is concealing responsibility. But the most common thing is to become in the habit of using the passive voice for no reason, and the result is a tedious, sleep-inducing style that lacks energy. Use active voice as much as possible. Use the passive voice sparingly when it really is appropriate. We can boil all this down to one easy to remember phrase. Save the verbs. That is, pay attention to your verbs, recognize your patterns of choice. How often do you use action verbs, and how often do you use weak, inactive verbs? Use active verbs whenever possible. Revise inactive verbs as much as possible. The result will be energetic, concise, simple prose.